Shall we start? Are you ready? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Juliet, how do you say your surname? Benoit. Professor Dr. Julien Benoit. Julien is a French paleobiologist who has recently been appointed as a senior researcher in paleontology at the Evolutionary Studies Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand. He has been there now for 3 years. He's a specialist in X-ray computed tomography, which he uses in order to investigate the internal anatomy, in other words, the brain, the nervous systems, blood vessels, and biology of mammals and their ancestors, specifically the mammal-like reptiles, Therapsida. But he will explain all that. Okay, shall we give him a welcome?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, loud and clear. Okay, good evening, everybody. So thank you for coming to this lecture. So as the topic has already been introduced, I just move to the subtopic. So we'll talk about the transition from reptiles to mammals. And the first step of this series of lecture will be to look at the origin of what I will call the mammalness, which means how do you become even more mammal at each step of that evolutionary line. So yeah, sorry, this is my real accent. And to answer the second question, I can't help it. So yeah, if you miss anything, if anything is not clear, please feel free to interrupt me and ask me to repeat again, because I know it can be difficult for the people who listen to me. So let's answer some basic questions. So first, the timing. When does this transition from a reptile-like creature to a mammal-like creature occurred? So I don't expect you to recognize all these words or to remember all these dates, of course, but it's just to show you that basically you can divide the history of life on Earth, and particularly the history of vertebrates on Earth, so the animals with a backbone, into 4 steps. So the oldest steps is the age of fish, which ended 360 million years ago, and then you have the age of amphibians and mammal-like reptiles, then the age of reptiles, which is the age of dinosaurs, also called the Mesozoic, so from 250 million years to 66 million years ago. 66 million years ago is a very well-known boundary. It's the extinction of dinosaurs, so meteorite, no more dinosaurs. And then comes the age of mammal, which ends here with us and all other animals that accompany us today. So here we will focus on this interval of time, mostly the Permian, which is the age of mammal-like reptiles. So this is more or less the age of amphibians. But the mammal-like reptiles already existed a bit at the end of the Carboniferous and persisted a little in the Triassic. So, but yeah, the Permian will be our landmark in this journey to mammalian evolution. Where do we find these mammal-like reptiles? Where do we find these mammalian ancestors? This is a picture I took on a field trip in the Karoo. So here you have successions of rocks that are between 300 million years old and 200 million years old, and that covers basically 80% of South Africa. So yeah, from Cape Town to Joburg, you can cross from very old deposits to the youngest deposits, so 300 million years to 200 million years old deposits. And these deposits end up with the Drakensberg lava. lava deposits. So the Drakensberg is basically a big volcano. And around this volcano, you have all these deposits. So it's very easy to understand the order of deposition, because the more you go from Johannesburg to Cape Town, the older the rocks becomes. So from the younger rocks, you can document the evolution of fish, so the age of fish, remember? So you can see that you don't have to be a paleontologist to recognize this as a fish, which is a pity for me, because I won't have a job anymore if all fossils look like that. So fortunately, there are fossils that look like that, like a blob. But in this blob, you can identify a backbone here and the two wings of the pelvis. So it's the skeleton of a big reptile that comes from around Sutherland in the Karoo. So the Karoo has an enormous potential, and it's basically legend for us paleontologists. I'm coming from France, and when I was a student, people were looking at me and saying, "You're not worthy to go in the Karoo. Have better marks." Because the Karoo is legend among paleontologists. It's the place to be to look for fossils, and particularly to look for this transition from reptiles to mammals, but also to look for the evolution of dinosaurs. The very origin of dinosaurs is recorded here at the border of the Lesotho, and the origin of turtles, many groups, and many groups that are now extinct originated in the Karoo at this time. So now, what are we going to look for? So first, where do this idea of mammals coming from reptiles come from? Why do we have this idea that mammals came from reptiles? It's very easy. It's because people one day discovered this very strange looking animal, the beak of a duck, the body of a otter, I don't know. We don't have the tail, but the tail looks like a castor tail. So this very strange animal is a mammal because it has hairs. It milks its young. It gives milk to its young. So it's definitely a mammal, but it lays eggs like a reptile. And from the discovery of this animal came a series of studies that discovered more and more all the reptilian characteristics of the mammalian body plan. And one of these is when you look at the placenta, you find the exact same layers inside the placenta that you find in a reptilian or a bird egg. So the amnios, the chorion, the allantois are all these organs that makes the placenta actually an egg that you basically keep inside your belly. So a mammal is just an advanced type of reptile. And that's why we think that mammals came from reptilian-looking animals. And these reptilian-looking animals are called the Synapsida. So that's the scientific word for mammal-like reptiles. If you've already heard about mammal-like reptiles in the press, for example, Synapsida is the scientific word to call this series of animals that links the mammals to their reptilian ancestors. But what do we have in common with those synapsids? I mean, look at this. I'm not like this. So you will be right to ask, what do I have in common with that lizard, that strange-looking lizard? We have something very simple to describe. We have something called a synapsid fossa. So that's what gives the name Synapsida to those reptiles. So the synapsid fossa is a hole in the skull. So here you have the nose, the orbit, and at the back of the skull you have a hole. So in the beginning of the evolution of mammal-like reptiles, this hole was very small. And you could hardly argue that this looks like a mammal if you had lived at that time. But then the hole enlarged, and then the brain case, so this little stripe of bone here between the two holes is the brain case, and then the brain case enlarged to give what you find today in mammals, and in this particular mammal, which is a hominid. So that's what happened. So this hole here, so you have your zygomatic arch, your jugal arch here, you have a hole here. This hole is the same hole as this one. And that's what makes these reptilian-looking animals relatives. That's what draws the line between them and us. Another character that links the synapsids to modern mammals is the dentition. So in mammals, you have different teeth. You have a canine, and before the canine you have incisors, shovel-like incisors, and after the canines you have molars and premolars, so teeth that are made for crushing. Everybody's familiar with that, I guess. Now if you look to a mammal-like reptiles, what do you find? You find the same thing, a canine, teeth that come before the canine, different teeth that came after the canine, And here you can see, this is one of my students, showing a nice skull of one of those mammal-like reptiles, and what do you see? You see incisors, canine, post-canine teeth, and here this is the eye, and here you have the big canine. You can't see the pre-canine or the post-canine teeth, but you have the big canine in the middle that separates the dentition between a pre-canine dentition and a post-canine dentition. And this differentiation, you find it nowhere else in nature. Like you look at a crocodile, you look at a lizard, they basically all have the same teeth. You look at a shark, they all have the same teeth. No, not all sharks, but yeah, they don't have canine anyway. So yeah, that's a character that is mostly unique to synapsids and mammals. And be super careful then, because most of the time, everything that looks like a reptile and is extinct is called a dinosaur. Synapsids are not dinosaurs. Here you have the basic difference between a synapsid and a dinosaur. So the synapsid, I told you, there is one opening after the orbit. In dinosaurs, you have a skull that is descending from this type of skull, which have two holes after the orbit. And actually in dinosaurs, they evolved even further in the perforation of the skull, if I can see. Fenestration, we call it fenestration of the skull. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 holes in the skulls, in addition to the orbit. So synapsids and dinosaurs are completely different things. It's two different lines of vertebrates that give rise to two very different kinds of animals. So synapsid gave birth to mammal, and dinosaurs eventually, but it's not the topic of that course, dinosaurs eventually led to birds. Not crocodiles, birds. But this is even weirder. So now, let's look quickly at the classification of synapsids. So here is a tree of vertebrate evolution. So among these vertebrates, I told you there are the dinosaurs here. So the dinosaurs are there, and the synapsids are there. So you recognize the pelycosaurs, and they're leading to mammal. And these synapsids are divided into three big branches. The basalmost branch, the basalmost group, is called the pelycosauria, the pelycosaurs, and they are characterized by a sprawling posture. So they were walking like lizards, with the legs on the side of the body. Then you have the therapsids, the second group, which is characterized by a semi-erect posture. So it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen a crocodile galloping, but the crocodile, when it gallops, it goes from a sprawling posture to a semi-erect posture. And it gallops like this, and then goes back because it's lazy. And so these were like crocodiles, more or less, with a semi-erect posture, like half-flexed legs. And these are called the therapsids. And the last group is called the cynodonts, cynodontia, which has a fully erect posture like mammals. So I'm a mammal, and my legs, at least, I'm a hominid, so my arms are free, but my legs are right under my body. I'm not sprawling, I'm not half erect, I'm right. And you look at a cat, you look at a dog, you look at a horse, they all have the legs right under their body. So this is a character that we share with that particular family of synapsids called the cynodonts. And actually, the cynodonts are the most relevant, it is the most relevant group for the evolution of synapsids, so we will talk a lot, for the evolution of mammals, sorry, so we will talk a lot about them. So here you can see a very beautiful cynodont from it's at the museum in Cape Town, and you can see it's preserved in what I call the fossilized me position. Please keep me alive forever. So you see that kind of fossil is really a gift. I mean, you have all the complete skeleton, and everything. There's not like a hand under the body that you can't see. Everything is there, and it just shows everything for us. So you can thank this one for showing us that much information. And be sorry a little because it's dead. So you'll find again that same division, so the pelycosaurs, the therapsids, the cynodont, and on the top, the mammals. And here is the time. And you can see that this transition from a sprawling animal to a semi-erect animal to a completely erect animal is very smooth. There's no gap. Why? Because we have the Karoo. We have the most beautiful series of fossils that you can find anywhere in the world documenting that transformation. So there's no gap. So what happens when there is no gap? Then you have to create an arbitrary boundary. Yep, you have to create an arbitrary boundary. At some point you have to say, okay, something in there is a synapsid, something in there is a mammal, but what do we call the things in between? And that becomes a problem. So you have to create a boundary, and what the paleontologists have collectively chosen over years as a boundary is the jaw joint. So the limit is the jaw joint. In reptiles, you have a jaw joint between the quadrate and the articular bone. So there are two bones in the back of the jaw that are specifically dedicated to the articulation of the lower jaw with the skull. And then in synapsids, what you see is a transformation, a reduction of these two bones. They become very small and then completely disappear. And the articulation turns into an articulation between the dentary and the squamosal bone. So dentary here and squamosal. The difference is you don't have a bone that is specifically dedicated to the articulation. The dentary here makes the articulation, but it also bears the teeth. The squamosal, it makes the articulation, but it also participates to the orbit and to the synapsid fossa. So you have a shift, a functional shift from the reptilian character to the mammalian character. And this transition, you can see, is also smooth. So where do we define the limit? We define the limit when the mammalian type of articulation becomes dominant over the reptilian type of articulation. And this becomes a This becomes a problem not for all therapsids, but we can reduce the problem to like one or two species that are really difficult to to classify, like this one from the Triassic of South Africa called Probenognathus. Sorry for the pronunciation. In Probenognathus, the problem is that you can see there is an articular quadrate articulation here. So it's the inner side of the jaw, that's the outer side of the jaw. So articular quadrate articulation and a dentary squamosal articulation, and they are quite similar in size. So this is like the perfect intermediate. This is the only one we don't really know what to do with it, but for everything else we can draw a straight line smaller than this, and the articulation is considered more mammalian. Bigger than this, and the articulation can be considered more reptilian. Synapsids, mammals. But now I guess the big idea is to understand that it's completely arbitrary, because there's no clear cut in between. And what is funny now, I can come back to this one, is that the mammalian articulation still exists in modern mammals, including us. You see, this is the articular, this is the quadrate, this is the inner ear, and this is the stapes, but the stapes, we are more used to call it the stirrup. You see, that's the stirrup, that's the incus, which is the equivalent of the quadrate, and that's the malleus, which is the equivalent of the articular. So I think you call it the hammer and the anvil. So hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And this series of bone is the exact same series of bone that you find when you look at a reptile, articular, quadrate, and stapes. So the reptilian articulation has turned into the ossicular chain in the inner ear. So that's why we say that we talk about a dominant mammalian articulation and not only just a mammalian articulation, because the reptilian articulation is still there, but it's very small. Okay, any questions now before I continue? I know it's not easy, but now we have been through the classification part, which is disgustingly technical. So now we start the funny things, but before we start the funny things, maybe you have some questions. So what brought? Okay, we'll talk about that tomorrow. That's tomorrow's lecture. But to be quick, it's because we developed chewing. Remember, I told you we are the only animals with molars. And the fact that we have molars means that we are chewing our food, and there's no other animal, particularly reptiles, they don't chew their food, they swallow, bloop, like this. And because we are chewing our food, we need a very strong jaw. The problem, when you're a reptile, you have more than one bone in your lower jaw. Now, this is not clear there, but here, actually, in a reptiles, you have about 7 or 8 bones inside your lower jaw. And this is like a puzzle. And it weakens a lot, the lower jaw. And when you need to chew, to masticate, you need a very strong jaw. That's why, in mammals, all these extra bones went back in the bottom of the jaw, and there's only one bone, the dentary, forming the complete lower jaw, because it strengthened the lower jaw. And then we will see that tomorrow there is a trade-off between hearing capabilities and chewing capabilities. Because, of course, when you masticate, everyone here knows what happens when you eat chips. You can't hear the television. So there is a trade-off between the evolution of mastication and hearing. And the chips experiments shows you that it's not already optimized. We can do better. In the future, we can improve that. So the conclusion of all this classification thing is to tell you that there is the arbitrary limit, and after that we talk about mammals. Okay, we know what we are talking about. Before that, we are talking about non-mammalian synapsids. So now I will talk about synapsids, I will talk about cynodonts, but remember that we'll talk about non-mammalian cynodonts and non-mammalian synapsids. Because this limit being arbitrary, that means that we technically are synapsids. Like you've heard many thousand times that human is descending from apes. No, descends from apes. No, technically we are apes, because we decided to cut a line between apes and human, and it's arbitrary. Same thing. So here Similarly, you have to cut an arbitrary lines between non-mammalian synapsids and mammals. But we are technically synapsids. And in these in these non-mammalian synapsids, we put pelycosaurs and therapsids, so the sprawling and the half-erected animals. Okay, so now the funny part, the origin of mammalness. So we will talk about the origin of endothermy, which is the warm blood, but we will go in further detail into the definition of endothermy, but for now, let's call it warm blood. We will talk about the origin of hair and about the origin of milk, of lactation. So first, what does being warm-blooded mean? Yeah. Here you have a table in which I put all the four main types of physiology of metabolic metabolism. Let's make it easy. So the four big types of metabolism that you can encounter in animals, in modern animals. So lizards, we say they are cold-blooded because they need to warm up using the sun or the warmth in the walls, and that their temperature is not constant. So if your body temperature depends from the outside temperature, and if your body temperature varies, you are an ectothermic, poikilothermic animal. Then, if your temperature varies, but it's independent from the outside temperature, so you have an independent body temperature, it does not depend on what is the temperature outside, then you have a poikilothermic endothermic animal. So this is a bush baby. The bush baby can decide that it will drop its temperature at some point just because there's not enough food. There's not enough food, so like a marmot. And I wake up when there is more food. So hibernation, like bears, marmots, all these animals that can drop their temperature are poikilothermic and endothermic. But so the question is, would you call this warm-blooded, as you call us warm-blooded, us who keep at the same temperature all the time, except if we are sick? So that's one question. So when we talk about warm-blooded animals, we have to be very specific about what we call warm-blooded. Because there are also some animals, like that giant sea turtle, that can keep their temperature constant, stable, but their temperature depends from the outside temperature. How do they achieve that? Because they live in a warm ocean that stays warm all the day, all the year. That's one way to achieve it. That's what they do. Or they are so big that their temperature never varies. That's what, for example, dinosaurs did. The dinosaurs are so big, and that's the next slide. They are so big that they behave like this giant cup of coffee. The bigger is your cup of coffee, and the more time it will take to cool down. But dinosaur is not a giant cup of coffee. It moves. So it creates energy with its muscle. So basically, it creates energy, and it's not losing energy. So it stays warm, but never cools down. So that's an homeothermic, ectothermic animal. The temperature still depends on the outside, but the outside have to be super cold for these animals to become cold. Okay, the problem with mammals is that they are mostly small. Most of them, not elephants. And the mammals started small. So here is a therapsid, so half-erect animal. Here is a cynodont, completely erect animal. And here is the earliest mammal ever found. Megazostrodon from South Africa. It was found at the border of Lesotho, and the skull is literally this size. So it's very, very small animals. It's a very small animal, and we found a little cousin of this one in England, same size. And all these early mammals, they were very, very, very small. So now what's the problem in terms of body temperature when you're very small? You're like the small cup of coffee. You lose your temperature very quickly. So you have to produce a lot of energy to stay warm. Or you have to bask. But the problem is that these early mammals, we know for sure they were nocturnal. They were nocturnal because they were living at the same time as dinosaurs, and if they were not, and if they were trying to concurrence the dinosaurs on their own territory, they would have been crushed very quickly. So these early mammals were nocturnal, and you can see in their nervous system there are a lot of adaptations for nocturnality, but we will talk about that tomorrow. So they could not bask. So how do you stay warm and active in the night without basking? You have to be endothermic. So at some point, between this big guy and this medium-sized guy to this tiny, tiny guy, the synapses shifted from this condition to this condition. The question is when? When did they shift it? So this was probably already endothermic. This was very likely ectothermic here and poikilothermic. But what was that? Did the transition occur there or before or after? So that's the big question, the very big question. And we'll try to answer that. And to answer that, we have to find an anatomical correlate that can actually fossilize, that we can follow and that we can follow in the fossil record. So we have to find evidence of endothermy in the fossil record. That's what it means. And what's the best evidence for endothermy we have today? It's hair, because a fur coat acts as an insulation device that keeps your body warm. And when it's too hot, then the hairs just retract, and the warmth of your body can be evacuated. So hair is the best correlate to endothermy, to warm blood. So now let's go back to simple questions. We want to find hairs in the fossil record. So first, let's define what is a hair. So here you have three little reptiles. One of them has no scale, this one has little scale, this one has big scales. It's because this one and this one are mutants for a gene called EDA. So these bearded dragons, when they are mutant with this EDA gene, lose their scales. It's interesting. And it becomes even more interesting when you look at mammals, including humans. When they have the same mutation, they don't have hairs. No hair, no nails, and very bizarre teeth. The teeth fail to develop very well. They are there, but pointy, very spaced. It's not a very nice smile to look at. And actually, these are all the epidermal structures. Teeth belongs to the epiderm. Teeth are basically modified scales, and what this experience shows us, what this mutation shows us, is that actually hair are also modified scales. So the hair evolved from scales, and they form from the embryo. They form from these little structures here that are called placodes, epidermal placodes. So it's the same embryological structure that gives birth on the one side to the hairs and on the other side to the scales. And what's interesting when you look at the fossil record is really patchy for the evolution of hairs, and we don't have we can't really pinpoint the exact time when hairs evolved, but we can see a general pattern, and this general pattern is that in the sprawling pelycosaurs there was evidently scales. In the semi-erect therapsids, the skin seems to have been naked or glandular. You can see it, this very small patch of skin that is glandular. So this one, it was found near Grahamstown, if I'm not mistaken. No, near Bloemfontein, sorry. It was found near Bloemfontein. You have the head, you have the legs here and the hind legs there, the backbone, and you can see it's a little mummy. So it mummified in a first step and then fossilized as a mummy in a second step. This is about 250 million years old. So that's one of the oldest mummy you can ever find in the world. And the skin here is perfectly preserved. You can even see the eyeball here. It's disgusting. And yeah, the hair are evidently absent in this one. And then you move to a mammal, definitely a mammal, no cynodonts unfortunately, but in mammals you have hairs. So here you can see the fur here around the tail, here around the back, and here on the face. So the fossil record confirms that scales have preceded hairs in synapsids. So at least it's consistent with what you can see in the ontogenetic development. But that does not give us the exact point where hair evolves. So that's where my research starts being relevant in that topic. Yes? Sorry?
Those two examples that you had, the Sandodont and then the one on the right-hand side, where were those actually found?
So this one is from China, this one is from Bloemfontein, this one is from Russia, this one is from North America. All around the world. But we have the best. Whoop. Don't break the material. Sorry. Yeah, so where was I? So yeah, we need to pinpoint the time when hairs evolved. And to do this, we have to use something that fossilizes better than hair themselves. And my first project when I arrived in South Africa was to look at what is called the third eye, because this third eye is located in a hole in the skull that is very conspicuous. First, you can see that skull. This is the snout. These are the orbits. This is the third eye, the hole for the third eye, and it's called the parietal foramen. So this hole is very conspicuous, and it's directly imprinted on the bone, so it fossilizes very well. You can see here a reconstruction of the brain in a skull, and you can see that the third eye is connected to the midbrain. This is what these animations show you. So this is the third eye. You can see that it has a lens, it has a retina, like a proper eye, a cornea, and it's connected to the brain with a nerve, which is the equivalent of the optic nerve. And all this structure is called the pineal organ. So the complete package is called the pineal organ, and this structure here is called the pineal eye. And it's often called the third eye because, of course, it's located between the two orbits, and it's in the middle of the skull. So, of course, it looks like a third eye. And as I showed you, it is constituted like an eye. It's the results of two eyes that fuse very early in the embryological development. They fuse super early in the embryological development, so you don't see them even if in the worst pathological case. You won't survive that kind of mutation that would create a second pair of eyes on your head. But this eye is actually present still in modern reptiles. So that's also what's interesting with this structure. It's not only present in the fossils of the synapsids, it's also still present in modern reptiles. And you can see here that iguana, they have that third eye below that scale, just in the middle of the skull roof, and they love being scratched on it. If one day you meet an iguana, they really love that, being touched on the third eye. It's also a very sensitive structure. So this third eye has many, many functions, and one of them, the most important one, is that it monitors thermoregulation. And that's why it's present only in exotherm species, like cold-blooded species. If you remove surgically the third eye from an iguana, for example, it will have a lot of trouble regulating its body temperature. And it's cruel, so we don't want to do that, of course. So modern mammals don't have a third eye. We are endothermic, so we don't need to regulate our body temperature. So we don't have a third eye. But sometimes a mutation occurs, a mutation of a gene called MSX2, and this mutation creates a parietal foramen. So let this be clear. The parietal foramen is located between bones called the parietals that are located here in synapsids, but the parietals are located here in humans. So if you would have a third eye, it won't be there. It would be there. Useless. Or at least, yeah. Except if you shave all your hairs like this. So here this person doesn't have a third eye, but he has the hole for the eye. Is this okay for everyone? I don't want to lose everybody at that level. He doesn't have the third eye, but he has the hole. And this is due to a mutation called MSX2, and in mice, this mutation, you can see, creates a tiny hole between the two parietal bones. And coincidentally, this mutation also creates mice that don't have hair and that don't have mammary glands. So everything seems like if you lose the third eye, you're gaining hair and mammary glands. You become a mammal. And that's a fantastic mutation. That's a fantastic mutation because it creates mammalness. And you see now why I was talking about mammalness all that time. It's because with this one single mutation, we can trace back the evolution of mammalness. How? We just have to follow the evolution of the parietal foramen. So the parietal foramen is not only linked to endothermy by the fact that the third eye is used for thermoregulation, it's also linked to the evolution of endothermy because it's a direct proxy for the evolution of hair and incidentally mammary glands. So once you discover that, then the only thing you want to do is check the evolution of the parietal foramen in synapsids to see at what point the parietal foramen was lost. So at what point did we go from a primitive condition, which is equivalent to the mutant MSX2, to that derived mammal-like condition, which is equivalent to what we call the wild type, so the normal type MSX2. So let's look at the fossils. So I searched, in South Africa, I searched all the collections possible for fossils that preserve the parietal foramen. So there are like 800 specimens, only skulls. So I'm not counting all the skeletons, but only skulls, there was more than 800 specimens. And I looked if they had a parietal foramen. And noting the presence of the parietal foramen, so that's what you see here, I noticed that in the basal forms, so the one sprawling and semi-erect forms, the parietal foramen is always present. So no surprise, the things that are not directly related to mammal are reptilian-like. And then you move to the more derived taxa, the more derived species, sorry, taxa is a technical term, jargon, don't use jargon. So then you go to the derived species. Some of them, the parietal foramen is variable, so you don't really know what's happening there. I still don't know what's happening there, honestly. But in the cynodonts, which are the most relevant, remember, for the evolution of mammals, the parietal foramen, at some point, it's present in the beginning, and then at some point, 246 million years ago, disappearance, total. So in the ancestor of this particular group of cynodonts, which is called the Probenognathia, so you remember Probenognathus, the one with the double jaw articulation in the beginning, is a representative of the Probenognathia. That's where the name of the family comes from. So these Probenognathia, they don't have any parietal foramen, just like mammals do. And this change happens 246 million years ago, and so that means that the MSX2 gene appeared at this level, or at least it mutated into the version of the MSX2 gene that we know today in mammals. So now you can say there might be some people that are skeptic about that, and they say, no, it's too easy. It's too easy, it cannot be. Cannot be that just one mutation triggers the appearance of hair. It cannot be. Maybe it's just another gene that controls also the parietal foramen. I have one last evidence. I have one last evidence, and this evidence is that the MSX2 gene, when it's normal, you have this part of the cerebellum, which is called the vermix, that is very wide, very long. And in the mutant animals, so the mutant mouse, that vermix becomes very short and quite undeveloped. And what you see in the fossil record, those cynodonts that do have a pineal foramen here don't have any vermix on their cerebellum, while the Probenognathia, they don't have the pineal foramen and they have a vermix on their cerebellum. So this is again another correlates that demonstrates that the MSX2 mutations occurred indeed in the Probenognathia and in the mammals. So all put together, we have a picture in which the cynodonts at some point, 246 million years ago, underwent a mutation of the MSX2 genes, and they turned from reptilian-looking animals to hairy and mammary glands-bearing animal. And very likely, incidentally, they very likely became endothermic. Okay, I still have a bit of time, so I have enough time to talk about the mammary glands. So, what about the mammary glands? So, indeed, I told you MSX2 is related to the mutant type of. Okay, I'm back. I'm back online. So when you have a mutant mouse with MSX2, you don't have mammary glands. When the mutant is wild type, it has mammary glands. So it means that the mammary glands evolved in those cynodonts probably 246 million years ago. But where do they come from, these mammary glands? They don't. We saw that the hair comes from scales, but where do mammary glands come from? It's something much more complicated than a hair. Indeed, the sweat glands. Actually, not that much the sweat glands, but what is called the apocrine and sebaceous glands. So here you can see the transformation. So what is interesting with this diagram, it shows you that the mammary glands, they are tightly associated to hairs. So we are eutherians, and so our mammary glands are completely devoid of any hair. There's no hair on our mammary glands. But in marsupials, you can see that the mammary glands here is associated with two hairs. They are sensitive hairs that, that help the mother feel that there is something at the top of the what's the name in English? The nipple. There's something on the nipple that is trying to suckle. So it helps the mammary glands. It tells the mammary glands to secrete milk. And in monotremes, then the condition is really, really gross in monotremes. So their mammary glands are all over their bellies. They don't have any nipple. And they just kind of sweat milk that creates dreadlocks with their hair. And the baby suckle the dreadlocks. So that's really gross. But yeah, you can Google it and find pictures on the internet. Yeah, the platypus and the echidna, they are monotremes. The marsupials, of course, kangaroos and things like this. Yeah. The monotremes, the platypus and the echidna. They are not the most popular animals in the world, but they still exist. The duck castor reefing that I showed you in the beginning. And so yeah, these mammary glands are derived from the apocrine and sebaceous glands of the skin. And the milk itself is derived of these glands, so the produce of these glands, kind of derived type of proteins, and there are also some blood proteins in the milk. So everything in a mammary gland and everything that a mammary gland produces is recycled from a pre-existing structure that was associated with hair. Hence the fact that the same gene, MSX2, is coding for hairs and for mammary glands. So this is no chance that the same gene codes for hair and mammary glands. It's because they are tightly connected structure. And finally, the fossil evidence for the evolution of mammary glands, because again, a mammary gland is just like a hair. There's no fossil nipple in the fossil record. And so how can you test that assumption? Here is a series of skulls, cynodont skulls, so the one that are very close to mammals, the one that evolve, that lost the parietal foramen. You take the other side of the skull, so the parietal foramen is on this side of the skull. You take the other side of the skull and you look at the palate. And the palate in this animal was soft in the beginning, so you can see here that little space in between the two sides of the jaw, here and there. It was soft in the beginning, and then it turns hard. And what is the interest of a hard palate? So you can do this. So you can create a depression in your mouth that helps you to suckle the milk out of the nipple. And if you are a reptile, you cannot do that. Because reptiles, if they try to do that, the air will go through their nose directly to their mouth. If I was a reptile, I could stick out my tongue through my nose like this. That would be disgusting, but that's what reptiles can do. So this is because we have a hard palate, or secondary palate, that we can suckle the nipples, that we can actually milk our youngs. And this also evolved in cynodonts. So again, another a good signal, we have a consistent signal saying that 246 million years ago evolved mammalness. And incidentally, yeah, I'm talking about parietal cares, we have a couple of fossils showing youngs associated with adult individuals enclosed in burrows. So you have like the mother is curled up and you can see the youngs next to her. Fossilized, I mean. Again in South Africa. So it's all connected. Everything forms a big circle of life. So we started with endothermy. Warm-bloodedness requires air. The air through the MSX2 gene is connected to the loss of the pineal foramen, which is through the same gene connected to mammary glands and lactation, which is itself connected to the evolution of a hard palate, which is itself connected to the evolution of chewing. Remember, I told you about that. And chewing improves the energy that you can extract from your food, which facilitates the creation of body warmth. All mammalness summarized in one picture. And why did all this occur? Last slide, I swear. This is the last one. So last slide, why do all this occur? Let's play a game. Where is the mammal here? Tell me what's the number corresponding to the mammal.
It's not here because it's daytime in this picture.
So good idea. Look at the side of the picture which is not in the light, in bright light. So there is one ear and another one ear. You can see the head there. So yeah, because of the light you can't really see, but yeah, here you have a cynodont and here you have a mammal. So the proper mammal is in the night. Yeah, because you have to represent a complete ecosystem in one picture. It's not easy, but yeah, the mammal is in the night, and in the bright days, you can see the dinosaurs. Because at that time, when mammalness evolved 246 million years ago, that's also the rise of dinosaurs, or at least dinosaurs' ancestors, the archosaurs. And the archosaurs are radiating, they are diversifying, they are becoming more and more prominent, and mammals are just becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and even more discrete and concealed to a nocturnal way of life 246 million years ago. And that's why we believe at this level mammalness evolved. Thank you very much. Perfect timing. If you have any questions.
MSX2. The gene is the MSX2.
Yes, MSX2. I don't remember what it stands for.